I'd been hiking for hours when the sun started to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the dense forest. I wasn't exactly lost, but the trail had faded into a thick patch of woods, and I was starting to question whether I had missed a turn somewhere. My only goal had been to find a good spot to camp for the night, but now I wasn't sure how far off the main trail I was. The crunch of leaves underfoot and the occasional snap of a twig breaking under the weight of my boots was all that accompanied me. The air was thick with humidity, making every breath feel slightly more labored. I had no cell service and wasn't expecting to, but I also knew I wasn't prepared to be out here after dark. That was when things started to feel off. The forest, usually filled with the sounds of birds and the rustling of animals, had gone eerily quiet. I had reached a small clearing and paused to look around. The trees here were so thick, their branches forming a canopy that barely let in any light. The wind had died, and the usual rustling in the underbrush was absent. I was alone, completely alone, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I checked my watch. It was getting late, and I needed to make camp soon. My stomach growled, reminding me that I hadn't eaten since breakfast. With a sigh, I pulled out a protein bar, trying to push away the growing sense of unease. The quiet wasn't helping. There was no breeze, no animal sounds, nothing. Just me, standing there in a patch of fading light, trying to decide if I should keep going or start setting up camp. As I stood there, staring into the forest, a sound broke the silence. A soft rustling, almost like someone or something was moving through the bushes just on the edge of the clearing. I froze, my heart suddenly pounding in my chest. I tried to convince myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer, but it didn't sound like one. It sounded too deliberate, too controlled. My instincts told me to keep moving, but my feet felt frozen to the ground. I didn't know why, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It was as if every tree, every shadow, held something I couldn't see but could feel. Shaking off the tension, I grabbed my pack and started walking again, deciding that getting back to the trail might make me feel safer. But the further I went, the deeper into the forest I seemed to get. The path became less defined, just a vague outline in the dirt, and I realized that I was veering off the main trail again. Panic slowly started to creep in. My mind raced through the worst-case scenarios. I could easily get turned around in this wilderness, and without proper lighting or shelter, I'd be at a serious disadvantage if night fell before I found my way out. My pace quickened, but it was hard to see much with the fading light. My flashlight was in my pack, and I regretted not pulling it out sooner. The sound of footsteps, light, almost inaudible, echoed through the trees behind me. I stopped. They stopped. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I glanced over my shoulder, but all I could see was the dimming forest, the dark trunks of trees standing like sentinels around me. There was no one there. I took another step, my footfall heavier now, and the sound followed me again. I wasn't imagining it. Something or someone was following me, matching my steps, but staying just out of sight. A knot tightened in my stomach, but I kept walking, trying to stay calm. I wasn't going to outrun whatever it was, so I kept my pace steady, determined not to let fear control me. But the sounds continued. The faint rustling of leaves, the snap of a twig underfoot, always just behind me. At this point, I didn't care if it was a person or an animal. I just wanted to get out of the woods, back to the trail where I could at least feel safer. But no matter how fast I walked, no matter how many turns I made, the sounds followed. It felt like hours before I finally stopped, my chest heaving from the exertion. My legs were sore, and the weight of my pack felt unbearable. I turned around again, hoping for a sign, anything to show me I wasn't imagining it. The forest was silent again, but my body was on edge. It was as if the world was holding its breath. That's when I saw it. Just past a dense clump of trees, a flash of movement, too quick to be anything normal. A figure, or at least what I thought was a figure. It was there one moment and then gone the next. I didn't wait to find out more. My heart raced, and I broke into a full sprint, zigzagging between the trees. My mind was screaming at me to get to safety, but my body was too tired, too worn out from the hike. Every branch and rock seemed to trip me up, and every time I glanced behind me, I expected to see something following. But there was nothing. Eventually, I stumbled into a small ravine, and I nearly collapsed. I was exhausted, my breath coming in short gasps. My legs burned, and I had scraped my arms on branches. The panic slowly started to fade, but the feeling of being watched never quite left. I stayed where I was for a long time, just sitting on the cold ground, trying to gather myself. The fear slowly started to give way to anger. I'd been a fool for not listening to my instincts earlier. After what felt like an eternity, I finally got up, determined to find my way out. I used the last of my energy to climb back up the side of the ravine, looking for any sign of the main trail. To my surprise, I found a faint path that seemed to lead in the right direction. I wasn't sure if it was the same one I had been on earlier or a different one entirely, but I followed it, hoping it would bring me back to civilization. By the time I made it back to the main trail, the sun had fully set and the forest was dark. But I felt a sense of relief wash over me as I pulled out my flashlight. I turned it on and pointed it down the path ahead. My body ached from the long day, but I kept walking, my pace steady and sure now that I knew I was on the right track. It wasn't until I reached the edge of the forest, where the trees began to thin out and the distant hum of traffic signaled the edge of the town, that I finally felt safe. I didn't stop until I reached the parking lot where my car was parked, where the familiar sight of the vehicle offered comfort I didn't realize I'd been craving. As I sat in the driver's seat, I looked back at the dark woods. I had no idea what I had been following back there, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going back into those woods at night again. The woods may have been beautiful during the day, but they were something else entirely when the sun went down. And I had learned that sometimes it's not the path you're on, but the things you encounter along the way that can make the biggest difference. That night I had been lucky, but I knew I wouldn't press my luck again. I was alone in the woods, not the kind of woods where you can still see a lot of people walking by, or the kind of park where there's a marked trail. No, this was deep into the wilderness, miles away from civilization. I had always been drawn to hiking and the feeling of being alone in nature. It had been a while since I'd taken a solo trip, and I was craving the peace of the woods. The sun had just begun to dip behind the mountains when I arrived at the trailhead. The air was thick with the smell of pine and the damp earth underfoot from the recent rain. I checked my backpack one last time. Plenty of water, some granola bars, a map, a small first aid kit, and my trusty flashlight. I didn't have much to carry, just the essentials for a weekend hike. I figured I would be fine, even if I ended up taking a longer path than planned. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. Maybe that was a mistake, but I'd been hiking on my own for years and knew the risks. Besides, I liked the freedom of not having to report in every few hours. It felt more real out here, away from the distractions of everyday life. The first hour was peaceful. The trail was mostly downhill at the start, making it easier to set a quick pace. The silence around me was almost deafening, broken only by the occasional rustle of a small animal in the underbrush. I lost myself in the rhythm of my steps, the steady crunch of leaves beneath my boots, and the rhythmic beat of my heart. As the evening approached, the dense trees around me began to block out more of the fading sunlight. I came across a small clearing with a decent-sized rock for sitting. I decided to take a break, eat some of my granola bars, and drink from my water bottle. I pulled out the map just to check my location. I hadn't seen a trail marker in a while, but I wasn't concerned. I had done this enough to know how to orient myself. That's when I noticed something odd. There were scratches on the rock next to where I sat. At first glance, it looked like just marks from the weathering of time, but as I looked closer, I saw that some of the marks appeared too deliberate, too fresh. They weren't made by the erosion of rain or wind. They looked like they had been scraped there recently, maybe even with a knife or some sort of tool. I wasn't scared, just curious. Who would carve into a rock like this, especially in the middle of nowhere? I shrugged it off, telling myself it was nothing important, and packed up to keep moving. The trail got steeper after that. It twisted and turned, the dirt path now turning into a more rugged trail that was harder to navigate. As I descended further into the valley, the trees became thicker, and the sound of birds seemed to disappear entirely. The forest was oddly quiet now, and the only thing I could hear was my own breathing and the crunch of leaves underfoot. I glanced at my phone briefly. It was already getting close to sunset, and I needed to find a place to set up camp. I had been hiking for hours without seeing a single person, and the last thing I wanted was to be caught in the woods after dark without shelter. After another half hour of hiking, I found a small plateau that seemed perfect for setting up my tent. There was a stream nearby, and the ground looked fairly level. I had just started setting up my tent when I heard something. It was a faint sound, at first, but I couldn't ignore it. I stood still, listening. The forest had become eerily silent, and now there was this strange sound. A low, rhythmic thumping, like the sound of footsteps, though it didn't seem to follow any natural rhythm. I tried to dismiss it as the wind, or maybe an animal, but the sound grew louder, and then footsteps. Too heavy to be an animal. Someone was walking, and they weren't far away. I felt a chill run down my spine. Maybe it was another hiker, but the forest was large, and I hadn't seen anyone in hours. I waited, straining my ears, but the footsteps stopped as suddenly as they started. I couldn't make out any voices or movement, just the eerie sound of silence again. I quickly finished setting up my tent, grabbed my flashlight, and sat down inside. I tried not to let the strange feeling settle in my chest. It was probably nothing, just my mind playing tricks on me. But the more I thought about it, the more I started to feel uneasy. Something wasn't right. I had been in the woods enough to know that when things get too quiet, it's never a good sign. I sat in the dark for a while, the light from my flashlight casting long shadows around me, until I finally convinced myself to go to sleep. But sleep didn't come easily. I kept hearing faint noises outside the tent. Small, quiet sounds, like twigs snapping or the rustle of leaves. I'd hold my breath and listen, but by the time I reached for my flashlight, the sounds would stop. It was maddening. Each time I thought I heard something, I convinced myself it was just an animal or the wind. Eventually, I fell into a restless sleep, but the uneasy feeling didn't leave me. I woke up several times during the night, each time hearing those strange noises. It wasn't until the early hours of the morning that the silence settled in, and I finally drifted into a deeper sleep. When I woke up, the sun had barely risen. I felt groggy, and the strange feeling from last night still lingered. I packed up my tent quickly and started walking, deciding to get some distance between myself and the spot where I had camped. The trail was steep and rugged, and I focused on putting one foot in front of the other, hoping that the open sky and daylight would make me feel better. I was deep into the forest now, following a narrow path that twisted through thick underbrush. The air was thick with the smell of pine, and I could barely hear the sound of my own breath. The woods felt different today, darker, as though something was watching me. Then, as I rounded a bend in the trail, I saw it. It was small but unmistakable, an abandoned campsite. There was an old fire pit in the middle and a half-buried backpack next to it, the zipper slightly open. The tent was ripped in places, and there was an unsettling stillness about the whole scene. I cautiously approached the site, my instincts screaming at me to turn around and leave. But curiosity won out. I went over to the backpack, and when I opened it, I was hit with the faint smell of decay. Inside, there was a half-eaten granola bar, a few dirty pieces of clothing, and something that made my stomach churn, a blood-stained rag. That's when the noise returned. It was faint at first, but now I could hear the distinct sound of footsteps again. They were heavier now, deliberate. My heart raced. I spun around, scanning the trees. There was no one there, just the same still woods. I grabbed the backpack and threw it back into the underbrush, deciding it was time to leave. My legs were shaking as I turned and started walking quickly down the trail. My heart was pounding, and my breath came in shallow gasps. I tried to push the thought of the campsite out of my mind, but it kept coming back, that feeling of being watched. I moved faster, desperate to get out of the forest, but no matter how quickly I walked, the feeling never left. It was as though something was just behind me, always out of sight but never too far. The woods around me seemed to close in, the trees growing denser and the path more treacherous. Hours passed, and I finally found myself at the edge of the forest. The sun was setting again, casting an eerie orange glow across the sky. I had made it through the woods without incident, but I felt as though something had followed me the whole way. I didn't look back. When I finally reached the trailhead and saw the parking lot ahead, I felt a surge of relief. I was safe. The woods were behind me. The air felt different, lighter, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I could breathe easily. I threw my backpack in the car and slammed the door shut. My hands were still trembling, and my mind kept replaying everything I had seen and heard. I couldn't explain what had happened, but I knew one thing for sure. I would never hike alone in that part of the woods again. I'd been hiking for hours, well past the point where the trail started to twist and wind through thick trees, with only the occasional glimpse of the sky through the dense canopy. The quiet was suffocating, broken only by the sound of my boots crunching on the dirt and the rustle of leaves underfoot. It was the kind of peace you only get when you're miles away from civilization. Just the wind and the trees and me. I had planned for this hike for weeks. The weather forecast had been perfect, and the route was supposed to be a nice, moderately challenging trail. It wasn't supposed to be anything crazy, but there's always something about being alone in the wilderness that makes things feel different. I'd hiked a few miles in when I realized that the trail seemed emptier than I had expected. There were no other hikers around. That wasn't exactly unusual. After all, it was a weekday, and most people didn't take to the trails when they had to work. But still, it felt a little eerie. As I continued, the landscape around me shifted. The forest opened up into a patch of overgrown shrubs, and then the trail became steeper. It was harder to find solid footing as the incline increased, and I had to be careful not to slip. Eventually, the well-worn path started to fade. I had been following a trail marker here and there, but suddenly, there was nothing. No signs, no arrows, just trees and rocks. I stopped, scanning the area around me. There was a faint, crumpled map in my pocket, but I didn't pull it out immediately. I figured I'd just keep moving and find another marker soon. I kept walking. The deeper into the forest I went, the more the air felt thicker, heavier. It wasn't so much that it was hot, but it felt suffocating, as though the forest was closing in on me. After another hour, the quiet started to get to me. The silence was unsettling now, far more than peaceful. I couldn't hear birds or insects, or even the usual rustle of animals. I had hiked through plenty of woods before, and I'd never experienced this kind of stillness. I checked the map again and noticed something strange. It was showing a point that didn't seem to match anything around me. No landmark, no creek, no hill, just a blank spot in the middle of nowhere. I paused, trying to figure out where I'd gone wrong. My instincts told me I was still on some sort of path, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had veered off the main trail somehow. The further I walked, the more uncertain I became. Then I heard it, a sound so faint at first that I wasn't sure if it was real. A snap of a twig. I froze. My heart rate quickened, and my ears strained for any other sound. There was no wind now, nothing else that could make that noise. Came again, closer this time. Someone or something was out there. My first thought was maybe another hiker, but something didn't sit right. I hadn't seen anyone in hours. Still, I figured it was just someone else on the trail, maybe a little behind me. So, I took a deep breath and started walking again, trying to ignore the prickling feeling crawling up my spine. The sound came again, louder, clearer. It was definitely someone walking, but the footsteps didn't sound like they were from a person. It was too uneven, like something was dragging or stumbling along. I stopped again, this time looking around more carefully. But the trees, thick and dark, offered no answers. Everything looked the same. There was no mistaking it now. Something or someone was following me. I wasn't imagining it. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I had always been good at sensing when something wasn't right, and this was definitely one of those moments. I moved quickly now, picking up my pace. It felt like the sound was following me, always just behind, as though whatever it was knew exactly where I was heading. I tried to stick to the trail, hoping that I'd hit some landmark soon that would give me direction. My legs were burning from the steep incline, but I couldn't slow down. I had no idea what I was running from, but I had to keep moving. The sound came closer, more urgent now, like something was getting closer, but I couldn't turn around. I just had to keep pushing forward. The trail led me to a narrow ridge, and I thought maybe it would open up to a view. It was a small relief, a break from the suffocating trees. But when I reached the top and looked over, there was nothing but a steep drop into the wilderness below. No exit, no help. Just the ridge and the ominous feeling creeping up my throat. I turned to keep moving, but that's when I heard it again. Closer this time, right behind me. The sound of dragging footsteps. It was too close. I turned quickly, adrenaline spiking, but there was nothing. No one. No movement in the trees. I stood there for a long moment, catching my breath, trying to reason with myself. Maybe it was just an animal. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something, movement in the bushes, just out of view. My heart hammered in my chest. It wasn't an animal. It was too big, too human-like in shape. I didn't wait to see what it was. I ran. I didn't care where I was going now. I just needed to get away. The path was rough, filled with rocks and loose dirt, but I kept running. I wasn't sure what was behind me, but I didn't want to find out. After what felt like an eternity, I stumbled across something that made me stop dead in my tracks. A trail marker. Not one of the usual wooden posts, but a simple, carved stone with an arrow pointing down a path that I hadn't seen before. I hesitated. The thought of following the arrow was tempting. It could be a way out. But the feeling of being watched was so strong now, my gut was telling me to avoid it. But there were no other choices. I took a deep breath and forced myself to follow the arrow, trying to ignore the sensation that something was moving with me, just out of sight. Minutes passed, maybe more, but I couldn't stop. The footsteps, the feeling of being followed, seemed to fade slowly. Eventually, I saw it, the end of the trail, a clearing. The trees parted, and I could see the sky again. I was back on a main path, and I didn't hesitate. I ran toward it, toward the sunlight. By the time I reached the edge of the forest, I couldn't remember how long I had been out there. My legs were burning, my throat dry, but the trail was clear now, and I had made it. I looked back once just to be sure. There was nothing there. I took a deep breath, relieved to finally feel like I was safe. I didn't look at the map again. I just kept walking toward the road, where I knew I'd find my way home. But as I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been waiting for me out there, something that had followed me all the way to the edge of the forest. It's a long story to tell, one that I will never forget, no matter how much time passes. It happened on a hiking trip that I thought would be just like all the other hikes I've done. A nice, peaceful trek through the woods, a chance to clear my head, maybe take a few photos, and just enjoy the beauty of nature. But this hike, it turned out, was anything but peaceful. I started out early that morning. The weather was perfect. The sun was shining, the sky was clear, and the air had that crispness that you only get at the start of fall. There were a few clouds, but nothing that looked threatening. I had planned this hike for weeks. It was supposed to be a day trip, just me, my gear, and the mountains. The trail I chose wasn't particularly difficult. It was a well-marked path, popular enough to be safe, but remote enough to feel like an escape. I've hiked before, but I didn't usually go into the deep, isolated parts of the forest. This one felt different, though, like it would give me the peace I was looking for. I packed light, only the essentials: water, snacks, a map, and my phone in case anything went wrong. I didn't think it would. I never thought it would. The first few hours went by without a hitch. The path wound through thick woods, the kind where the trees stand so close together that the light barely touches the ground. It smelled like pine and damp earth, with just a hint of decaying leaves. The sounds of nature filled the air: birds singing, leaves rustling, the occasional snap of a twig from a squirrel or deer moving through the underbrush. I was lost in the calm, just breathing in the fresh air, letting the rhythm of walking soothe me. But as I went deeper into the forest, something started to change. It was subtle at first. The sounds of the forest seemed to fade, or maybe I just stopped noticing them. It wasn't complete silence, but it was quieter. The birds that had been singing earlier were no longer calling. Even the wind seemed to have died down. I chalked it up to being deep in the woods. I didn't think much of it. At one point, I reached a part of the trail that felt a bit off. The trees here were older, their trunks gnarled and twisted. The ground was softer, more uneven, and the path seemed to narrow, almost as if the forest was closing in around me. I glanced at my map, but there wasn't much to go by. Just a few more miles ahead, and then the loop would start back. There was nothing out of the ordinary. I continued, but I started to feel an odd sense of unease. It wasn't fear exactly, but there was a tension in the air, the kind that makes you check over your shoulder more than once, even when you know nothing's there. I brushed it off as nothing, telling myself it was just the remoteness of the place getting to me. That's when I noticed the first sign that something wasn't right. There was a pile of rocks in the middle of the trail. At first, I thought it was just a natural formation, a random occurrence, but as I got closer, I realized that the rocks were deliberately stacked. It wasn't a cairn, like those hikers sometimes build to mark trails. No, these rocks were arranged with care, with intent. I knelt down, inspecting them. There was no real pattern to it, just a few rocks placed carefully on top of each other, like someone had put them there and then walked away. But there was something about it that sent a shiver down my spine. Felt wrong. It didn't belong in the woods. I stood up, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck prickle, and continued on. I tried to ignore the sense of discomfort growing in my chest. The feeling wasn't gone, though. It was like a weight pressing on me, subtle but heavy. I kept walking, pushing myself to just focus on the trail ahead, but my thoughts kept wandering back to the rocks. Maybe it was just some other hiker who had left them there, I thought. But somehow, I knew it wasn't that simple. The trail soon began to get steeper, climbing higher up the mountain. The trees grew taller, their branches reaching out like fingers, blocking the sunlight more and more. I had to pay more attention to my footing as the path became rockier and uneven. Then I came across another strange thing. It was a line of small, faded red flags tied to branches. They weren't bright or new. They looked old, like they had been there for a long time. They fluttered in the breeze, but the wind was so light it didn't seem like it should be strong enough to make them move. I stopped in my tracks. Something didn't sit right. These flags were far off the main trail, tucked into the trees, like they had been deliberately placed to lead someone off the path. I stood there for a while, staring at the flags. I felt a sudden urge to turn back. Something was wrong, but at the same time, there was this pull, this curiosity that kept me from leaving. I wasn't sure what I was hoping to find, maybe nothing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to keep going, that something awaited me further up the trail. The flags led me deeper into the forest, off the main path. I was already unsure about the decision, but I kept moving, telling myself that maybe I would just take a quick look. I walked slowly now, trying to make as little noise as possible, like I didn't want to disturb whatever was ahead. The trees grew thicker here, their trunks dark and twisted, the canopy so dense that it blocked out much of the sky. The air grew colder, the temperature dropping by a noticeable amount. I zipped up my jacket and continued onward. Then, I saw something that made my heart skip a beat. Ahead of me, through the trees, there was a small clearing, and in the center of it, there was something I wasn't expecting to see. It was a small cabin. It was old, the wood weathered by years of rain and snow. The roof was slanted, with bits of moss growing between the shingles. The windows were dark and covered in grime, giving the place an abandoned feel. But there was something off about it. The cabin wasn't on any of the maps. There were no signs of recent human activity. I approached cautiously, my heart racing now. I couldn't explain why, but I felt like I was crossing a line, like I shouldn't be here. But the curiosity still tugged at me. I took a few more steps toward the cabin, my footfalls muffled on the soft earth. When I reached the door, I stood there for a moment, hesitating. It was slightly ajar, just enough to make me wonder if someone had been here recently. I could hear the faintest sounds coming from inside, maybe the creak of the floorboards. I reached for the door and pushed it open. The inside was dark, the only light filtering in through the grimy windows. Dust particles floated in the air, illuminated by the little light that managed to break through the grime. The furniture was old and broken, covered in a thick layer of dust and cobwebs. It looked like no one had lived here for years, but still something felt wrong. I stepped inside, my feet making small sounds on the creaky floor. My mind raced with thoughts, trying to piece together what this place was, why it was here, and why I was standing inside it. But nothing made sense. I turned in a slow circle, inspecting the room. Then, I saw something on the wall. It was a symbol, crudely scratched into the wood. A shape that looked almost like a circle with lines radiating out from it, like rays of a sun. It looked ancient, like it belonged to some long-forgotten ritual. I didn't know why, but the sight of it made my skin crawl. I quickly turned away and headed for the door. I needed to get out. As I stepped back into the clearing, I suddenly realized something. There was no sound. The birds had stopped singing, the wind had died, and everything around me was eerily still. The world felt like it was holding its breath, waiting. I didn't want to be there anymore. Without looking back, I turned and started to make my way out of the clearing, back toward the trail. The sense of unease grew stronger, and I picked up my pace, moving faster than I should have. When I reached the main path again, I didn't stop. I kept walking, my breath coming in quick gasps, my heart thudding in my chest. I didn't know what had happened, what I had seen, but I knew I needed to get back to civilization. I didn't stop to rest, didn't even glance back once. I just walked until the trees started to thin out, until I saw the familiar trailhead sign, and then, finally, the parking lot in the distance. I was out of the woods. I never went back to that cabin. In fact, I've never gone back to that trail at all. And I still don't know what I saw there. or what was waiting for me. All I know is that I'll never forget the feeling of dread that hung over me that day. It was real, too real. I left that place behind, but it's never really left me. The memory lingers, haunting me with the question I can never answer. What would have happened if I had stayed? I had been hiking alone for hours. The sun was already starting to dip behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the trail. I had been on this path a few times before, but today something felt off. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, and the only sound was the crunch of my boots on the dirt trail.
No birds, no insects buzzing.
Just the steady beat of my heart and the distant rustling of leaves in the breeze. The trail had always been a place of calm for me. I came here to get away from everything. The noise of city life, the constant pressure of work. It was a kind of peace I couldn't find anywhere else. But today, something didn't feel right. I shook off the uneasy feeling, telling myself it was just my imagination. It had been a long day, and I still had a few miles to go before I'd reach my campsite. The trail wasn't difficult, but it wasn't easy either. It wound through thick forests, up rocky hills, and past bubbling streams. Beautiful, yes, but not for the faint of heart. If you weren't careful, you could easily get lost. And I wasn't the type to get lost. As I rounded a bend in the trail, I noticed something strange. It was a pile of rocks, more like a cairn but different. I'd seen cairns before, placed by hikers to mark a trail, but this one was too deliberate. It was as if someone had carefully stacked each rock in an odd pattern. I paused for a moment, studying it. The rocks weren't just placed on top of each other. They were wedged together, almost as if they were meant to stay that way forever. Felt wrong. I stood there for a while, staring at the rocks. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, a chill running down my spine. It wasn't like I'd never seen cairns before, but this one was different. This one made me feel uneasy. I quickly looked around, half expecting to see someone watching me, but there was nothing. No sign of anyone, no movement, just the trees, the rocks, and me. After a few seconds, I shook my head, telling myself I was being paranoid. I was tired, that's all. Nothing more to it. I continued walking, my eyes scanning the ground in front of me, trying to push the feeling of discomfort out of my mind. But as I walked, I couldn't shake the thought that someone, or something, was watching me. The silence felt thicker now, almost oppressive. I tried to focus on the path ahead, but the further I walked, the more I started to feel like I was being drawn deeper into the woods. The trail seemed to stretch on longer than I remembered. Every turn felt like it led me into a new, unfamiliar section of the forest. I looked at my map. I was still on track, but the trees looked different. The shapes of the branches twisted unnaturally, like they were reaching out to grab me. I stopped for a moment, taking a deep breath and scanning the area. There was a clearing just up ahead, where I'd planned to set up camp for the night. But the closer I got, the more I realized something wasn't right. There was an odd, almost metallic smell in the air. It didn't smell like nature. It didn't even smell like a typical animal scent. It was as if the air itself had become tainted. A sudden rustling in the bushes snapped me out of my thoughts. I froze, my heart thumping in my chest. My mind raced. Could it be an animal? A bear? I didn't want to find out. I slowly backed away, looking for a place to hide or at least a way to get to higher ground where I could keep an eye on whatever was out there. But the rustling stopped as abruptly as it had started, and the forest fell back into that suffocating silence. I stood there for a while, trying to calm my breathing. My instincts told me to keep moving, to get to the clearing where I could set up camp, make a fire, and feel safe again. But the closer I got, the more uneasy I felt. There was no clear path to the clearing anymore. It was almost as if the forest itself was rearranging, pushing the trail further away. I stumbled over a rock, catching myself before I fell, and that's when I noticed it. Pair of footprints. They were fresh, the edges still sharp, the mud soft from the rain earlier in the day. They were large, wider than my own, and they led off the main trail into the trees. My heart skipped a beat. I looked around, expecting to see someone who had passed this way recently. But again, there was nothing. The silence was deafening. I hesitated. Should I follow the tracks? The curiosity was gnawing at me, but it was more than that. Something about those prints seemed deliberate, as though someone wanted me to see them. Maybe they were trying to lead me somewhere. I couldn't explain it, but against my better judgment, I followed the footprints. The trail grew thicker, more tangled, the trees pressing in on me like they were trying to trap me. I could barely see the sky anymore. My pace quickened as the feeling of being watched intensified. The footprints led me deeper and deeper into the woods, where the trees were so dense it felt like I was walking through a tunnel. And then, suddenly, the footprints stopped. There was nothing ahead but a large boulder, wedged between two trees. It didn't make sense. The prints had led me straight to it. I circled the boulder, my mind racing. Why would someone stop here? That's when I saw it. At the base of the boulder, half covered by moss and dirt, was a small, rusted metal box. I knelt down, brushing away the debris. The box was old, its surface scratched and dented, but it was still locked. I reached for it, my hands trembling slightly, unsure of what I was doing, but I couldn't resist. Something about this moment felt important, like I was meant to find this box. With a little effort, I pried it open. Inside, there was nothing but a single piece of paper yellowed with age. I unfolded it carefully, my fingers trembling. The writing on it was faded, but legible enough to read. The path is never as it seems. Follow the signs, but beware the shadows. I stared at the paper for a long time. What did it mean? Was it a warning? Or just a cryptic message left behind by someone who had been here before? I stood up, still holding the paper in my hand. The rustling sound returned, louder this time, coming from somewhere behind me. My heart skipped a beat. I whipped around, my pulse racing, but again, there was nothing. No sign of anyone. The trail was as empty and silent as ever. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. I was getting too worked up. I had to get to the clearing. I had to get to safety. But as I turned to leave, I noticed something that sent a chill down my spine. The footprints were back. They were in front of me now, leading away from the boulder and back toward the trail. But they weren't the same prints. These were smaller, lighter, and they were leading me further into the forest. I stood there for a moment, the decision weighing heavily on me. I could follow the prints, see where they led, or I could head back the way I came, retracing my steps to the safety of the clearing. But before I could make up my mind, a loud crack echoed through the woods. A tree branch breaking somewhere nearby. It was too close. I turned and ran. I didn't know how far I ran, only that I had to get away. I was breathing hard now, my legs burning with exhaustion, but I couldn't stop. The trail was nowhere in sight. The trees blurred around me as I sprinted, trying to get to a place where I could breathe, where I could feel safe again. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the forest opened up before me. I stumbled into the clearing. I wasn't sure how I had gotten there, but I didn't care. I had made it. I dropped to the ground, gasping for air. My body was shaking. I looked around, my heart still pounding in my chest, but there was nothing.
No footprints. No shadows.
Just the quiet, still evening. I sat there for a long time, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The box, the footprints, the message. It didn't make any sense. But one thing was clear. I wasn't alone out here. After a while, I stood up, gathering my things. The night was closing in, but I wasn't afraid anymore. I wasn't sure what had just happened, but I knew I had made it through, and that was enough. I hiked back to the trailhead the next morning, and the world felt a little different. The trees, the rocks, the path, it all seemed more alive now. But I never saw those strange footprints again, and I never went back to that clearing. The forest had given me a warning, and I had listened. I've always loved hiking, the peace, the quiet, and the beauty of the woods. It's the kind of escape I need from the chaos of everyday life. So, when I had a weekend off, I decided to take a solo hike in a remote area. I've done this plenty of times before, but something about this particular trail felt different. It wasn't a popular path, and that's what drew me to it. I wanted to get away from the crowds and really connect with nature. I packed my bag the night before. Some water, snacks, a first aid kit, my compass, a map of the area, and my phone. I didn't plan on using it much, but I always carried it as a safety measure, just in case. I woke up early, before dawn, to get a head start. The air was cool, and the smell of pine and damp earth hit me as soon as I stepped outside. The hike started off easy, a gentle incline through a dense forest. The ground was soft beneath my boots, with a few rocks scattered around. I didn't see much wildlife at first, just the occasional bird flitting through the trees. The silence was one of the best parts. It was peaceful and calming. But as I kept walking, I noticed something odd. The trail seemed to be less maintained than I expected. There were more fallen trees blocking the path, and the underbrush was thick with tangled vines. I had to navigate around obstacles, ducking under branches and stepping carefully over roots. It was clear that not many people came this way. I didn't mind, though. I was used to rough terrain. But after a couple of hours, I started to feel something strange. It wasn't fear, but a sense of unease, like I wasn't alone, even though I couldn't see anyone around. I shook it off at first, thinking it was just my mind playing tricks. After all, I was deep in the woods, and my mind always wandered when I was alone for too long. By noon, I'd stopped for a quick break. I sat on a large rock by the edge of a small creek, sipping some water and eating a granola bar. The sound of the water flowing was soothing. I glanced at the map, trying to get a sense of how far I'd come. The trail wasn't marked very clearly, and I couldn't find any obvious signs of where I was. The map didn't help much either. I thought I was heading toward a well-known viewpoint, but now I wasn't so sure. I continued, telling myself that it didn't matter. I was here for the experience, not to follow some strict plan. As I went further, the trees began to grow thicker, and the sunlight barely filtered through the canopy. The air was heavier, and it felt like the temperature had dropped a few degrees. The quiet was almost oppressive, broken only by the occasional rustling of leaves or the distant call of a bird. At some point, I realized I hadn't seen any other hikers since I started the trail. I had passed a few trailheads at the beginning, but now I was completely alone. The isolation started to feel a little too intense. It wasn't fear, exactly, but more of a growing awareness that I was out here, deep in the woods, and if something went wrong, there would be no one around to help. As I walked on, I came to a fork in the path. One trail veered left, heading uphill toward a steep ridge, while the other continued along the creek, winding through the trees. I checked my map, but it didn't give me a clear answer. I could continue along the creek, or I could take the more challenging route up the ridge. I decided to head uphill, thinking it might lead to a better view or some kind of landmark. The climb was steep and difficult, and soon my legs started to burn. Sweat trickled down my face, and my breath came in ragged gasps. The trees around me seemed to close in even more as I ascended, blocking out what little sunlight was left. The trail was narrow, and I had to use my hands to steady myself as I pulled myself up over rocks and roots. It was at this point that I started hearing things. Nothing specific, just noises. A branch snapping here, a rustle in the leaves there. I couldn't see anything, but it felt like someone or something was just out of sight, moving with me. I stopped a few times to listen, but there was never anything to see. I tried to tell myself it was just animals, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but the feeling didn't go away. Finally, after what felt like forever, I reached the top of the ridge. I was exhausted, and my legs ached, but the view was worth it. The forest stretched out below me in every direction, a sea of green that seemed to go on forever. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself after the hard climb. The cool wind felt good against my skin. I spent a few minutes enjoying the view, then checked my map again. There was supposed to be a small cabin up ahead, just off the trail, where hikers could rest. According to the map, it was only a short distance away, but it wasn't marked clearly on the terrain. I figured it wouldn't hurt to keep going a little further, so I began my descent. The way down was even more difficult than the climb had been. The trail was steep, and I had to carefully pick my way down, using my hands to balance myself. The air felt colder, and the shadows seemed to grow longer with every step. It was strange how fast the light was fading. Just a couple of hours ago, it had been bright and sunny. As I rounded a bend, I saw something up ahead, a cabin. It was small and weathered, sitting alone in a clearing. It looked abandoned. The door was slightly ajar, and the windows were dark. I felt a wave of relief wash over me. Finally, some shelter. I walked up to the cabin and paused for a moment, listening. The area was eerily quiet, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I stepped closer to the door, which creaked open with the slightest push. I didn't want to go inside, but the thought of continuing on in the cold made me reconsider. I stepped inside. The cabin was empty, save for a few pieces of old furniture. A cracked table, a chair, and a dusty bed in the corner. The air inside smelled musty, like it hadn't been used in years. I wasn't sure why, but something about the place felt off. It wasn't just the isolation, it was something else. The walls seemed to close in on me, and my skin prickled with unease. I was about to leave when I noticed something odd, a piece of paper on the table. I walked over to it and picked it up. It was an old map just like mine, but it had been scribbled on with thick, dark lines. I recognized the trail I had been following, but there were marks all over it, as if someone had been tracking the path. The strangest part was the red X that marked a spot near the creek, where I had just been. A chill ran down my spine. I couldn't explain it, but something about that map felt wrong. I quickly stuffed it back onto the table and turned to leave. But before I could make it to the door, I heard something outside, a loud snap, like a branch breaking. I froze. I didn't wait to see what it was. I bolted out of the cabin and didn't stop running until I was back on the trail. The feeling of being watched intensified with every step I took. I didn't know who or what was out there, but I knew I had to get back to the car as fast as possible. The sun was nearly set now, and I couldn't tell if it was getting darker faster or if I was just too scared to notice. My heart pounded in my chest as I hurried down the trail, trying to ignore the sounds of twigs snapping behind me. I glanced over my shoulder, but there was nothing. The trail seemed endless. Every turn looked the same, and I couldn't remember which way I had come. My head was spinning, and my feet felt heavy. I kept going, though, pushing myself harder than I had ever done before. My phone had no signal, so I couldn't call for help. It was just me, alone in the woods. Eventually, I reached the parking lot, and I almost collapsed in relief. My car was still there, waiting for me. I didn't stop to take a breath until I was inside, locked the doors, and started the engine. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been following me. I kept checking the rearview mirror, expecting to see someone or something close behind, but there was nothing. I made it home that night, but I couldn't forget the cabin or the strange map. I didn't go back to those woods again. Maybe I imagined the whole thing, or maybe there was something in those woods that I'll never fully understand. But I've learned to trust my instincts, and my gut told me that place wasn't safe. The woods are beautiful, but there's always something to be said for knowing when to turn around and head back. I don't know what was watching me that day, but I know I won't be hiking alone in those woods ever again. It had been a rough few months. Work had piled up, personal stuff was becoming a burden, and I found myself feeling disconnected from everything. That's when I decided I needed to take some time for myself. Just get out of the house and clear my head. A hiking trip seemed like the perfect way to escape. I hadn't hiked in years, but I remembered the peace that came from being in nature, the crisp air, and the quiet of the woods. I decided to head to a well-known trail about an hour outside the city. It was a good distance to feel far away from everything, but not so remote that I'd have to worry too much about getting lost. Or so I thought. I packed light, just the essentials, a water bottle, a few snacks, a first aid kit, and my phone for safety. I didn't plan to go too far. Just a couple of hours up the mountain to stretch my legs and reset. The weather was perfect. A little overcast with a breeze, not too hot, but warm enough that I didn't need extra layers. I was excited to get started. The trailhead was easy to find. There were a few cars already parked when I arrived, but not many. I figured most people would be back down by the time I reached the summit. The air smelled fresh, like wet earth and pine. I adjusted my pack and set off. The trail was well marked, a dirt path that twisted through tall trees. The crunch of dried leaves underfoot was the only sound, along with the occasional rustle of birds in the branches. For a while, everything felt calm, just as I remembered it. My mind was starting to clear, the worries of life slipping away with every step I took. After about an hour, I started to climb higher. The trail steepened, and the trees grew thicker, their trunks gnarled and twisted. The further I went, the quieter it got. The usual sounds of nature, birds chirping, wind rustling through the leaves, began to fade. It was almost like the forest was holding its breath. I paused for a moment to take a drink of water. Looking around, I noticed something strange. There was no sign of anyone else on the trail. No hikers ahead, no one behind me. I'd seen a few cars in the parking lot, but it was like I had the whole forest to myself now. A slight unease crept in, but I shook it off. It was a peaceful morning. Maybe others had just turned back early. I continued. The next stretch of trail was a bit steeper. The path narrowed, and I had to watch my footing as I climbed over roots and loose rocks. The air seemed cooler here, the shadows deeper, as though the forest was closing in around me. I had to stop a few times to catch my breath, but I didn't mind. The effort was worth it for the view. When I reached a small clearing, I took another break, sitting on a large rock, looking out at the valley below. But even as I sat there, the peace started to feel off. The silence had become oppressive. I could feel the stillness in the air, as if the forest had suddenly become too quiet. I tried to shake the feeling. Maybe it was just the altitude or the isolation. I stood up and kept going. The trail started to curve around a bend, and that's when I noticed the first sign something wasn't quite right. A broken branch, freshly snapped, lay across the path. It was big, too big to have fallen on its own, and the break was jagged, as though something had forced it to snap. I stepped over it, feeling a tightness in my chest that wasn't there before. The feeling that I was being watched crept over me again, more intense this time. It wasn't just the quiet of the woods now. It was something else. I pushed forward, trying to ignore the growing sense of unease. The path began to narrow even further, turning into a kind of overgrown trail, the grass and brush pushing in from both sides. The trees had grown even thicker here, their branches reaching out like long fingers, casting strange shadows in the dappled sunlight. I had to duck under a low-hanging branch, and as I did, I felt a sudden shiver run down my spine. It was then that I realized how cold it had gotten. The temperature had dropped sharply, and I hadn't noticed it until now. I checked my watch. I hadn't been hiking for that long. Maybe 2 hours, but the change in the air was undeniable. My breath started to come out in small puffs of mist. I walked on, trying to stay calm. The path curved again, and that's when I saw something ahead of me, movement. Something darted between the trees. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. It was fast, too fast to be any normal animal, and it had been so sudden. It was gone before I could make out any details, but I had seen it. Whatever it was definitely bigger than a squirrel or a rabbit. I stood there for a few moments, unsure of what to do. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and the unease turned to genuine fear. But I was so deep into the hike now. It would take longer to go back down than to continue. So I took a deep breath, told myself it was nothing, and pressed on. The trail began to descend, a little more steeply than before. The brush had become denser, almost claustrophobic. I had to push my way through thick undergrowth and duck under more low-hanging branches. It felt like the forest was swallowing me whole. I kept looking around, trying to shake off the feeling of being followed. The shadows had grown longer, stretching across the path like dark hands reaching toward me. That's when I saw it, the second sign something was wrong. A trail of broken branches, fresh ones, leading off the path into the dense woods. It was like something had been moving through there recently, pushing through the brush. I followed the trail for a few steps. My curiosity piqued despite my growing sense of dread. The broken branches led me to a small clearing, and that's when I saw it. A structure, not a cabin or anything like that, but an old wooden platform partially collapsed. It was covered in moss, but I could make out the remnants of what had once been some kind of lookout or shelter. It looked like it had been abandoned for years, but the weird thing was that it didn't seem entirely forgotten. There were fresh footprints in the dirt leading to it. A cold chill ran through me. The footprints were too large to be mine, and they looked too recent. The air was still thick with that uneasy silence. I stood there for a moment, trying to gather myself, but the unease in my gut had reached its peak. It was time to go back. I turned to leave, but that's when I heard it. A faint rustling just off the trail. I froze. My heart pounded in my chest, louder than anything else. The rustling grew louder, closer, as though something or someone was moving through the trees just out of sight. I turned and started walking quickly, my pulse racing. The trail, which had seemed so familiar on the way up, now felt unfamiliar and threatening. The dense woods closed in around me, and the rustling continued, always behind me, just out of reach. Every so often, I'd catch a glimpse of something moving in the corner of my eye, but when I looked, there was nothing there. My steps quickened as the path grew steeper, the way down becoming more treacherous. The air was colder now, the mist starting to gather between the trees. It felt like the forest was alive, watching, waiting for me to make a mistake. I didn't dare look back anymore. I focused on my feet, careful not to trip, and kept moving as fast as I could without breaking into a full sprint. The sounds of rustling and snapping branches seemed to grow louder the closer I got to the trailhead. Finally, after what felt like hours, the trees began to thin out, and I saw the edge of the forest. The trailhead was just ahead, the parking lot visible in the distance. I didn't stop until I reached the car, slamming the door behind me as soon as I was inside. My heart was still racing. As I started the engine and pulled out of the lot, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The forest looked peaceful, quiet again, but I knew better now. Whatever it was, whatever I had felt out there, it wasn't over. I wasn't sure what had been following me, or if I had been imagining things, but I didn't plan on going back anytime soon. The road stretched ahead, and I felt a sense of relief wash over me as I left the forest behind. The fear slowly faded, but the memories of the broken branches, the strange footprints, and the feeling of being watched would stay with me. But for now, I was safe, and I was never hiking that trail again. The sun was low on the horizon when I set out, my boots crunching against the dry leaves and fallen branches of the trail. It was late autumn, the air crisp and cool, and the trees around me were a patchwork of reds, oranges, and yellows. I had planned this hike for weeks, wanting to get away from the noise of the city, to just be alone with nature for a while. I didn't mind the isolation. In fact, I welcomed it. The quiet was exactly what I needed. The trail started easy, winding through the forest, the path clearly marked and well-trodden. There were a few other hikers passing by, but as the hours went on, I started to notice fewer and fewer people. By the time I reached a fork in the path, the only sounds were the wind rustling through the trees and the occasional call of a bird. I could feel the weight of the place settling in on me, a sense of stillness that seemed to swallow the world. But it was peaceful, too. I didn't mind it. I took the left fork, my backpack heavy with water, snacks, and the gear I thought I might need. The map showed that it was a loop not too far, about 8 miles or so, with a clearing at the halfway point where you could camp for the night. I figured I'd get there before dark, set up a small camp, and enjoy the sunset. It was a simple plan, and I didn't think it would go wrong. The trail grew steeper, winding up through a rocky section of the woods. The trees here were more spread out, their roots gnarly and exposed, twisting over the ground. I had to watch my step more carefully, but the effort was worth it. The air felt fresher, the scent of pine and damp earth sharper as I climbed higher. The sun was almost gone by the time I reached a small ridge overlooking the valley below. The view was breathtaking, and I paused there for a few moments to take it all in. I could see miles of forest stretching out in all directions, and in the distance, a line of mountains rose up against the fading light. It wasn't until I started descending into the valley that I began to notice something strange. The trail became less defined, the markers harder to spot. The trees grew thicker, their branches twisted into strange shapes, casting long, eerie shadows across the path. It was like the forest was closing in on me. I told myself it was just my imagination playing tricks, but something about it felt off. Still, I pressed on. I wasn't about to turn back now. The deeper I went, the more the woods seemed to change. The air grew colder, and a thick fog began to creep in, curling around the trunks of trees and swirling at my feet. It was getting harder to see, and I found myself squinting into the mist, trying to make out the trail ahead. But there was nothing to see except the gray blur of fog and the dark shapes of the trees. I checked my watch. It was almost 7 p.m. now. I was supposed to have reached the clearing by now. The light was fading fast, and the fog wasn't helping. I started to feel uneasy, but I pushed those thoughts aside. I wasn't lost. I'd just taken a wrong turn, that's all. I checked the map again, but the route seemed right. I was still on track. At least that's what I told myself. But when I looked around, all I could see was an endless stretch of trees and fog. There were no landmarks, no signs of civilization, no sound but the wind whispering through the branches. It was unnerving. It felt like I was being swallowed by the forest, the way it seemed to close in on me with every step further into the fog. I kept walking, hoping to spot a clearing ahead or some sign that I was still on the right path. But the further I went, the more everything seemed to blur together. It was like I was walking in circles, retracing the same ground over and over again. I couldn't remember the last time I saw a trail marker or even a signpost. After what felt like hours, I finally stopped, leaning against a tree to catch my breath. My heart was racing now, It wasn't just the hike that was wearing me out. It was the growing sense of unease. Something wasn't right. I could feel it in my bones. I hadn't seen another person in hours, and the only sounds around me were the rustling of the trees and my own breath. The fog was thicker now, almost suffocating. I glanced at my phone to check for service, but there was nothing. No bars, no signal. Just the silent screen staring back at me. Panic started to creep in, but I shoved it down. I wasn't lost, I reminded myself. I just needed to find the trail again. I retraced my steps for what felt like hours, hoping that I would stumble upon a sign or a familiar landmark. But every direction I took seemed to lead me further into the fog, deeper into the forest. My legs were aching, and the cold was starting to seep into my bones. It felt like the trees were closing in on me, their twisted branches like fingers reaching out, trying to pull me into the shadows. By now, it was nearly pitch black. The fog was so thick I couldn't see more than a few feet in front of me. My flashlight barely made a dent in the darkness. I tried to stay calm, but it was getting harder. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Something was watching me. And then I heard it, a rustling noise from behind me, just at the edge of the fog. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I listened intently, but there was nothing else.
No footsteps, no voices.
Just the whisper of the wind through the trees. I shook my head, trying to clear the thought. It was probably just an animal, I told myself. Bears, deer, whatever. Nothing to be afraid of. But the rustling came again, this time closer. I spun around, my flashlight scanning the fog, but there was nothing there. Just the darkness stretching out before me. My mind was racing now, my breathing shallow and fast. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. I forced myself to keep walking, even though my legs felt like lead and my thoughts were clouded with fear. I didn't know where I was anymore, didn't know which direction was the right one. All I knew was that I couldn't stay in this place. I had to get out. As I stumbled through the fog, my foot caught on something, and I fell hard to the ground, scraping my hands and knees. I winced at the pain but didn't have time to dwell on it. I scrambled to my feet, heart hammering, my head spinning, and then I saw it. In the distance, through the thick fog, there was a light, a faint, yellow glow, barely visible but unmistakable. My breath caught in my throat, a sign of life. I wasn't alone out here after all. I hurried toward the light, my legs moving faster despite the pain. The fog seemed to part just enough to allow me a glimpse of what was ahead. And when I reached it, I couldn't believe my eyes. It was a cabin, small and rustic, sitting in the middle of the woods like some kind of forgotten place. The windows were dimly lit, and there was a small porch with an old rocking chair swaying gently in the breeze. It looked abandoned, but the light inside suggested otherwise. I knocked on the door, my pulse racing. When no one answered, I pushed it open, and to my relief, it was unlocked. Inside, there was an old wood stove, a small table, and a few chairs. The air was warm, a stark contrast to the cold outside. I stepped inside, shutting the door behind me and leaning against it for a moment to catch my breath. The cabin was empty, but there were signs of recent use. A half-eaten sandwich sat on the table, and a coat was draped over the back of a chair. I sat down, trying to calm my racing heart, when I heard it again, the rustling outside. It wasn't just the wind this time. It was something else, something closer. I wasn't alone, and whatever was out there, I had no idea what it wanted. But I didn't have a choice. I had to face it, and I would.